finally Christmas in the Hudson Valley. This is the latest of the Hannah Arendt Center's Lunchtime Talks, and I welcome you all here. I'm Roger Berkowitz. Today we have a guest from Rutgers University, Douglas Irvin. He's actually an ABD PhD candidate at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. A wonderful sounding, very upbeat sounding, a place to hang out, I'm sure, in New Jersey, another upbeat place. And we're very happy to have him here. Obviously, anyone who's at the Center for Genocide and Human Rights belongs to give a talk at the Hannah Arendt Center. I think especially apt because of his interest in Raphael Lemkin's work. And he's here actually at Bard to do some work at the Hannah Arendt Center, Hannah Arendt Library, look for some overlaps between Lemkin and Arendt. So he'll be talking a little bit about that relationship, and we welcome him here. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. To begin my presentation, I want to thank Roger Berkowitz and the Hannah Arendt Center for extending an invitation, and also Jeffrey Katz and Helene Tiger, yeah. Who have arranged for me to visit the library. And a special thank you to Robert Koch for his generosity as a scholar. We met in Tokyo, and he spent a couple hours unnecessarily with a graduate student to explain to him just what I need to look for if I want to investigate this historical curiosity that is China that supports the Genocide Convention after World War II. And I thank him for making all the arrangements, bringing me here. This is also a great experience for me because I think, I've just learned the last couple of weeks of this wonderful center. The collection here of Hannah Arendt's papers and her library is a wonderful resource, and it's been a pleasure getting to know all of you. So I want to speak today about two contemporaries. They're intellectual contemporaries. Their paths intersected, and they dedicated their lives to exploring the darkest of humanity's inhumanity. But they had very little to say explicitly about each other, except for a few pointed criticisms where neither mentions each other by name. They are Hannah Arendt and Raphael Lemkin. This to me is just a delightful part of doing historical research into political affairs. I'll get into this in a second. To frame this, my talk is drawn from a dissertation on Raphael Lemkin, life and works. Lemkin invented the concept of genocide and authored the first legal and political analysis of the Nazi German state right in the middle of World War II. To think about the history of this, genocide as a word was invented, Lemkin invented the word genocide sometime in between 1941 and 1943. It was first published in 1944. I'll get into the lineage in a second. Lemkin served as a legal advisor to the War Crimes Tribunal in Nuremberg. In the late 1940s, he single-handedly pushed the United Nations to enshrine genocide as a crime under international law. And the legal historian and the scholar Richard Falk and many others have pointed out that if left to their own devices, states and diplomats would never have passed a single humanitarian law after World War II, and that was actually individuals, private citizens, and civil party groups that forced humanitarian law into the UN system. And Lemkin was the leading figure for this campaign to enshrine genocide. One of the backdrops that I think is important here is that it was India, Panama, and Cuba who introduced the resolution to pass the Genocide Convention in 1946. India was a British colony and was using their membership in the UN to try and force the London government to grant the rights of British citizenship to all people living within the British Empire, regardless of whether they're Indians or South Africans or whatever. India's support of the Genocide Convention was backed by all formerly colonized members of the UN, except for a few in Latin America, and totally opposed by all the former colonial powers. The U.S. wanted nothing to do with this. There's Frank Chalk is a scholar, historian in the University of Montreal, who's looking for the Canadian archives for memos that he knows exist saying that Canada were the diplomats were saying that Canada would be guilty of genocide if the Genocide Convention passed. New Zealand explicitly said, we will be guilty of genocide if this passes because of our treatment of Aborigines. What happened is a diplomatic battle ensued to redefine genocide, which produced our current UN law. I'll get to these definitions as I proceed. But the point is that the US and the English idea and the French idea of what international law should be won the day between 1946 and 1948. The ideas coming from around the world about what humanitarian law should be were silenced. And these were ideas that Lemkin tapped into and attempted to articulate, very much so. In this fantastic twist of historical irony, since everybody beats up on China now, rightfully so, with their respect for humanitarianism, China actually stood by India supporting humanitarian law in 1946. And this is where Professor Robert Koch has been so helpful to me. So, on to Lemkin and Arendt. So, December 9th, 1948, the UN adopts this humanitarian treaty, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It's the first humanitarian treaty in the UN. It's Lemkin's landmark accomplishment. The convention marked the beginning of a new system of legal norms and humanitarian norms that concretized the principle that states could be guilty of crimes against people, and that groups could have legal protection, and that leaders could be held responsible. In this sense, it follows up from Nuremberg. The Genocide Convention laid the groundwork necessary for the current international transitional justice regimes, tribunals from the International Criminal Courts, and UN-backed tribunals in Rwanda and Cambodia, to domestic courts in Spain, which have revived Lemkin's original definitions of genocide and claimed universal jurisdictions to try leaders of foreign states of genocide that were committed in around the world in other countries. The word genocide has also taken on a symbolic and moral quality as the crime of crimes, the darkest of humanity's inhumanity. And the appellation genocidaire is reserved for the bloodiest and worst of tyrants. Yet for as prominent as the word genocide has become, Lemkin himself remains a forgotten figure in the history of ideas. The law he invented lives on and works dynamically, but the Lemkin's name and his ideas have seemed to vanish. I think while it's worth remembering Lemkin for his own sake, this is the goal of my dissertation, the connection between Lemkin and Arendt is impossible for three reasons. And this is what shapes my talk. The first reason, let's spend some time on this. Many scholars now recognize Arendt as the philosopher who provided the ontological and moral grounding for the phenomenon of genocide that Lemkin invented. After all, both define genocide as an attempt to destroy an entire group and, as such, as an attack on human diversity. However, there's a subtle difference between their views, which hinges on what they believe humanity to be. Let's begin to investigate. While Arendt writes frequently of genocide, she is actually using the word very differently than the way Lemkin used it. One reason why Arendt uses the term differently is because she was a philosopher interested in law, while Lemkin was a lawyer interested in philosophy. Both were towering figures in the history of the 20th century, who concerned themselves with genocide and totalitarianism. But they speak very differently about these things. I'll provide examples in the following. But for now, let's note that Arendt gives outward clues that signal her distaste for Lemkin's ideas. For example, she writes about the, quote, jurist and professional idealist whose genocide convention was not fit for the protection of animals. She writes this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She's obviously referring to Lemkin. But what could she possibly have meant by this? On the one hand, she's deploring the reality that philosophers don't write the law, but leave it to jurists who are concerned with clear meaning and political expediency more than they're concerned with erudition. On the other hand, we notice her frustration in the sentence by using the word animals, as if the Genocide Convention can't protect individuals, let alone animals. It's such a bad document. Here we get to the heart of the matter. While Arendt and Lemkin might both be using the words genocide in very similar ways, Arendt understands very clearly that Lemkin's idea of genocide is not about protecting individuals at all. Lemkin would actually agree with her. Why? But first, let's be clear. Arendt thought the whole project of the Genocide Convention was somewhat foolish. How could a group exist without the individuals who constitute it? Okay. Why protect the group, the social group, while leaving the individuals who constitute the group vulnerable to state terror and mass killing? Why concretize this in law? Sure, it is a nice thing to do, but what was the purpose of that? All right, I'll explain by pursuing Lemkin's and Arendt's intellectual biographies. In the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip these sections. But we know here that Lemkin was very influential in Poland. He's a huge jurist. Came to the U.S. in 1941, then taught at Duke. In 1940, before he came to the U.S., he gave a series of very important lectures at Stockholm University, which were on the currency and clearing exchange policies of totalitarian regimes. These lectures are the move where he begins to formulate the idea of genocide. He ended up in Stockholm in 1940 because in 1939, Russia and Germany split Poland and forced him to flee. He had to run because in 1933, at the League of Nations, Lemkin had proposed the crimes of barbarism and vandalism, that they be enshrined into international law. And these crimes, vandalism, outlawed the destruction of cultural works by a state. Barbarism outlawed the destruction of people because of who they were. And he proposed these with, I'll get into this, I bring questions and answers if anybody wants. But
Is he Jewish?
Yes, Lemkin is a Polish Jew.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. He gets into this by way of his work with a radical, I guess what we'd call radical, maybe avant-garde, groundbreaking is a good word, group of jurists in the League of Nations who are trying to make minority treaties very concrete. And they're using Spanish, 17th century Spanish theologians to make this case. It's a fascinating thing. I can get into this in the questions and answer. But Lemkin then has this moment of fame in 1944 when he invents this concept of genocide, but it's a flash because the Nazi regime had orchestrated for his firing in Poland as a lawyer, had orchestrated his complete dismissal. His ideas of barbarism and vandalism were laughed off the table. How could you hold states guilty of crimes? It's absurd. And then shortly after he passes the Genocide Convention, people in the U.S. don't want to hear this idea because this genocide is something the U.S. is doing against Native Americans and so forth. So Lemkin has 15 minutes in fame. Arendt, of course, has this, locks herself as a canonical figure into the history of ideas. The crux of the matter is that Lemkin never was able to publish any of his works. He left 20,000 pages of unpublished documents, which are in the New York Public Library, the American Jewish Public Library in New York City, and in Cincinnati. And here's where my dissertation is. But anyway, Lemkin's writings touched the pulse of scholarly and general public in the Americas and Europe long before her reporting on the Eichmann trials. Lemkin, on the other hand, right, with this brief flash of fame, was never really able to make his thoughts public. So the world at large would not discover Lemkin's ideas until the early 1990s, when a wave of international criminal tribunals and a new demand for strong international humanitarian law began to wash over the world in the wake of the Cold War. It was only 2 decades ago when the word genocide began to work its way back into the parlance of our times. By that time, the world had begun to notice Lemkin's ideas and speak the words Lemkin invented. But Lemkin was long gone, the vast body of his work was not available. So international criminal tribunals now have recently explicitly said they wish to return to see what Lemkin had intended. Okay, Lemkin is forgotten. So what's this idea of genocide? All right. So, go back to Stockholm, where Lemkin is giving these lectures at the university. He begins to compile these lectures through access to official Nazi gazettes that the Stockholm University has. And he begins to list the laws and the policies of the Axis powers. He's listing policies such as forced changing of names, things that ban religious practices, He is looking at the way the Nazi state manipulates finance territory to undermine the way of life of a group of people living in such and such province in Austria. He is looking at the way of religious persecution. Not once in Axis Rule does he ever mention the mass killings of Jews or the concentration camps. Yet I know that he knows they existed by the time Axis Rule in Occupied Europe was published. He just did not consider the killing of people to be tantamount to genocide. Killing of people was a technique that genocide could be achieved. But so was the law and culture and so forth. Okay, so let's dig deeper into Lemkin's idea of genocide. Lemkin derived the word genocide from the Greek word genos, meaning a tribe or a race, and the Latin word cide, to kill, and intended the concept to signify a colonial practice of destroying social groups and nations. And here we remember that his previous work had all been on had used so heavily Francisco de Vitoria and the writings of jurists who dissented against the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Simply and elegantly, Lemkin writes that genocide is a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. Genocide had two phases for Lemkin. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. The Nazi regime wanted nothing short of the colonization of all occupied Europe with the complete destruction of cultural diversity and the total imposition of Germanness, Lemkin wrote. And this genocide would not only result in the total destruction of entire ways of life, but also lead to the death of countless millions. We note a strong similarity between Lemkin and Arendt in the sense that Arendt linked totalitarianism to European colonialism, and Lemkin links the Axis genocide to European colonialism as well. And both were adamant that the Nazi treatment of Jews was not the only defining moment of the totalitarianism or genocidal moment. But where Arendt's views genocide and totalitarianism to be new things in modernity, Lemkin considers genocide to be an old phenomenon. And remember, in the history of ideas, he's working on this idea long before the outbreak of mass killings. So long before 1940, he made his career as a jurist, working to reform these minority protections treaties with the League of Nations. I'm going to skip a little bit past this in the interest of time. But in addition to this fascination he has of Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomé de las Casas, Poland in the interwar years had a thriving intelligentsia and an artistic scene, which Lemkin was a part of. His mother was a painter and a poet, and very widely renowned. And Lemkin himself was deeply influenced by German Romanticism, as well as popular anthropologists such as Branislaw Malinowski, who used the work of these German Romantics to talk about culture as organic wholes. Lemkin's archives are filled with references to Malinowski and cultural diversity around the world. With these romantic influences, Lemkin should be understood as a communitarian thinker. And to skip past this, but we could talk about this later. Let's look at actually Lemkin's indebtedness to von Herder. Herder was one of the first to form the vision of cultural relativism. He argued that taste, values, aesthetics, concepts, beliefs, and morals vary greatly from culture to culture and from history. And he laid bare one of the strongest 18th century critiques of European colonialism, arguing that the expansion of the European state trampled cultural diversity inside and outside of Europe. This is pure Lemkin. And in my dissertation, I'm going to demonstrate that Lemkin's writings mirror Herder's almost exactly. Romantic thought stemming from Herder would be built on the premise that every nation and culture had a right to exist. And referring directly to Herder, in a speech on the passage of the Genocide Convention in 1948, Lemkin proclaims, quote, that the Genocide Convention brings into international law the very dignified concepts of nations, races, and religious groups as objects of protection. End of parenthesis, we've got our answer about this whole issue with the animals. Lemkin wasn't trying to protect individuals from the state. That was the purpose of the doctrine of human rights. Lemkin was trying to protect groups as organic wholes from the state. That is, he was attempting to protect group identities, which could be killed without killing a single individual. Arendt is very different. And this is where I think the connection between the two is so important historically. she's, we all know, she's a deeply liberal thinker who emphasizes the role of rights in individuals and the polis. The polis, to recap very briefly, since assuming we're all familiar with this, is the realm where individuals come together to act in public, the realm of politics ordained by free speech and thought. The key here is that for Lemkin, one did not gain his or her individuality through the community, through the polis, so much as one brings his or her individuality to the community. The human plurality of individuals in the polis is what made all political life possible. Now, we know that the key here is that in totalitarianism, she talks about the destruction of the polis as an attack on human plurality, which produces this rule of nobody, renders deliberative participation, meaningful participation in public life impossible. Arendt's vision of human plurality is almost entirely at odds with Lemkin's communitarianism. As Lemkin wrote in Axis Rule, quote, "The world represents only so much culture and intellectual vigor as are created by its component national groups." Essentially, the idea of a nation, this is all quotes, essentially the idea of a nation signifies the constructive cooperation and original contributions based upon genuine traditions, genuine culture, as well as well-developed national psychology. The destruction of a nation, therefore, results in the loss of its future contributions to the world. Lemkin expressed his communitarianism by referring to the, quote, harmony between different culture-bearing groups in the constellation of world society. This part I take from reading his unpublished archives. Lemkin takes from the romantic tradition, a belief that one gains his or her individuality from the community. And in Lemkin's vision, communities interact with each other to produce the human cosmos. For Arendt, it is individuals who interact with each other to form the human cosmos. The difference in their thought is what separates Lemkin's ideas so drastically from the political thought of Arendt, as well as successive generations of thinkers who approach genocide from a liberal or individualist tradition, or see genocide as the mass killing of individuals because of their group identity. So what was Lemkin's idea of a nation? I'm going to skim this part, but Lemkin defines nations as families of minds. And he draws from the French art historian, romantic historian, Henri Fonce-Lyon, who defined nations as groups of people who recognized shared symbols in art and could connect each other. It's a precursor to the Benedict Anderson idea of a nation. So let's see, skip this here. One of the parts that I'm going to elide is that what's a very interesting part of Lemkin and Arendt's differences is their writings on Algeria. Shortly after the Genocide Convention is passed, where Lemkin begins to argue that the French are committing genocide in Algeria, and it is exactly the same as the Nazi genocide in Europe, because he did not consider genocide to simply be about mass killing. He writes that the Nazi regime in Europe was breaking the family of minds within Europe to create a homogeneous unit where the state could then expand its economic and political reach without obstruction. He writes that the French were doing the same thing in Algeria, but they were using different tactics other than killing. What's key here is that Arendt has a totally different take on what's happening in Algeria. If we read on violence, Arendt writes that politically speaking, violence and power are total opposites. So we remember that she believes totalitarian domination established through violence. In this moment, power disappears entirely. So for Arendt, the French in Algeria were, to their credit, keeping alive the possibility of political change by not turning colonization into totalitarianism through mass death. So they weren't killing people. Therefore, people as individuals had the ability to form new political constellations. So Lemkin, who did not see genocide as synonymous with mass killing, nor intended the definition of genocide to signal the death of genocide to signify the death of individuals, we've had none of this debate. So, I'm kind of skipping this, hope that part is sort of clear. Lemkin believed that he could ground human freedom by protecting cultural diversity under the rubric of liberal international law. This is one of the intellectual curiosities that I just enjoy. This sentiment underpins his address to the American Jewish Congress upon the passage of the Genocide Convention. He tells the Congress, A variety of nations, races, and religious groups represent the great enrichment of our civilization. World culture is like a subtle concerto. It is nourished and gets life from the tone of every instrument. When you destroy one instrument, the harmony is destroyed. That is the reason why the world has been fighting Genghis Khan and Hitler. Because it was felt that brutally imposed national or racial patterns by one nation over a race over an entire world would be the end of civilization. Lemkin's metaphor of a concerto, where each culture-bearing group enriches human civilization, draws on Herder's thought, and he borrows the words directly from the work of the Italian romantic Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini writes that each nation plays its own instrument to produce a single harmonious symphony of nations, which constitutes world civilization. Genocide, insofar as it destroyed national diversity and disrupted this symphony, threatened the foundations of the human condition. Alright. This leads to my second point, which is a very quick point, and here I wrap up the talk. Today the word genocide invokes images of Auschwitz or mutilated and nameless bodies in Rwanda. But as Lemkin imagined it, genocide was not a violent crime. And here we draw a very stark contrast between Arendt and Lemkin. Indeed, for Lemkin, violence and mass killing could be used to commit genocide, but genocide, remember, could be committed through all sorts of different means in Lemkin's ideas. The law, religious persecution, finance policy, all of these destroyed the national patterns of groups. Genocide was the intentional destruction of groups' collective identities through all of these sorts of mechanisms. Genocide was an attack on cultural diversity. Arendt saw genocide as an attack on cultural diversity too. She just didn't see cultural diversity as the source of human freedom, necessarily. After all, for Lemkin, political formations, the new polis, new groups, new communities are all formed constantly by new collections of individuals. Yes, the only way to destroy the polis is to destroy the individuals who constitute the polis. For Arendt, genocide and totalitarian rule go hand in hand. Both were marked by violence and the breakdown of political formations. Successive generations of liberal scholars and activists share this point exactly. This debate between Lemkin and Arendt can illuminate many current issues in political affairs. In particular, the movement within the UN to redefine sovereignty as the responsibility to protect people living within state borders. Known as R2P, this movement explicitly harkens back to Lemkin's proposals in the League of Nations in 1933 to redefine sovereignty in a way that protects minorities. But it maintains this liberal belief that it's violence that is the most important part of the crimes that a state can commit. We also note at this point that many UN delegates around the world in 1946 were not convinced, however, that they wanted to follow such a Westphalian liberal model of statehood, believing this to be the troubled legacy of colonial rule. Lemkin's idea of humanitarian law would offer them a way out of this system, because Lemkin would offer a model for saying humanitarianism was about protecting cultural diversity. But it also offered people around the world a chance to oppose the foundations of a system of states that they deeply equated with colonialism. Arendt, in contrast to Lemkin, here follows Karl Jaspers and Eichmann in Jerusalem to argue that the flaw of the Eichmann tribunal was that it claimed to be trying crimes against mankind, but the courts were not sufficiently representative of mankind. Let's parse this a moment in light of what I just said. The position presupposes that liberal international law was capable of representing the interests of a universal mankind. This belief, in turn, presupposes that a universal mankind desired to be represented by liberal international law. That is, mankind as a whole is presupposed to desire a liberal form of law. But our investigation into Lemkin's vision of a non-liberal humanitarian law challenges this view completely. And the popular desire around the world to enact non-liberal forms of law demonstrates clearly that the liberal form of international law that Arendt takes for a given in the work at the end of her career especially was historically produced. This leads to my third point. We have seen that Lemkin was adamantly opposed to humanitarian law in liberal terms. That is, he rejected the concept of human rights. He defended his position by saying that liberal rights were more important than protecting individuals, but they could not guarantee human freedom as such. In fact, Lemkin was one of the most vocal and staunch opponents of the UN Declaration of Human Rights during the late 1940s. Same as Arendt, but for different reasons. So this third point is that there are still many people around the world who contest the ability of human rights to guarantee freedoms, but they do so in a way It's very different than the discourse that we get in Western circles. I think reinvigorating this Lemkin and Arendt debate can help inform us on these matters. How much am I doing okay on time? Should I?
It's about there.
It's about there?
All right. You could finish up.
All right, I'll do this to finish up here. So we should not forget, this is my concluding paragraph. I'll sum it up this way. Let's not forget that Arendt, while she viewed human plurality as being constituted by individuals coming together through the polis, she did believe genocide was an attack upon diversity as such. She believed, on some level, that the Jews as a group had a distinct experience of the human condition, and the potential loss of this experience would mark the loss of humanity as a whole. For Arendt, the Genocide Convention or the War Crimes Tribunals, however, couldn't ground human freedom, but they could preserve what it meant to be human. This is, she lays this out in Eichmann in Jerusalem. Likewise, but in opposite terms, Lemkin affirmed the importance of the concept of individual rights, but he believed they couldn't ground human freedom, and he recognized that without them, without individual rights, the state would have unlimited rights over the life and well-being of people. So is the Genocide Convention not fit for the protection of animals? Yes, Arendt is right. Nor is it fit for the protection of individuals. It is fit for the protection of cultural identity, designed to enshrine a doctrine of cultural relativity into the rule of liberal law. It is the romantic signature of our age, and when we consider why the Genocide Convention does not work, we should consider this historical evolution of the idea. All right.
There was a lot in there. I'm gonna let are there other opening comments or questions that people have? Greg?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering whether, he has an idea of different levels of human cultural organization. It seems like in other receptions of the sort of Herderian tradition, even people like George Jelinek or Herman Cohen, when you talk about defending a multiplicity of associations, it's not simply sort of major cultural groups or nations.
Right.
They can be down to individual groups of associations based on a common interest, in a legal sense. Does he have a way of saying at what point you offer legal protection and at what point you don't? Because particularly if people haven't formed a active, his anthropological examples are really interesting in this, but if people haven't formed something legally representable, how exactly does one decide? I mean, it seems like an obvious problem, but I'm just curious if you have an answer to it.
Well, this is one of the curiosities of Lemkin, is an intellectual pack rat, who's not a philosopher, but a jurist who managed to get this law passed. He thinks it's pretty self-evident if you read Branislaw Malinowski in Anthropology. It doesn't necessarily help us, right? He simply defines, in his unpublished work where he writes about the law, international law, he wants to overthrow much of the Western liberal tradition that comes out of the state system. And part of that means defining the state as potential criminal against people, right? And people in this sense could be any family of mind. That's how he defines it. Mm-hmm. He's not talking about organic nationalism like the Germans, and you're German because you live in the nation state, or you're British because you live in the nation state. And he's talking about multiple nations, quote unquote, families of mind within Germany, within England, trying to figure out how you protect those.
Mm-hmm. But I guess then I just wonder, how would you deal with associations ranging from the Naval League to the Fly Corpa Culture? You have all these associations where people claim to have their own version of self-understanding among each other, and I think, to some extent, what I take you as saying is that really what he's saying is he's defending groups against the state. Yeah. Quite at what level you define the group is a different question, but he wants to defend them against, and in that way I can see it being sort of intelligible, when the state is doing something to break up a group. Again, there's an obvious practical problem that I think he's aware of, but it just is an interesting problem.
To this discussion, first a question or two. This discussion, first of all, there's an intra-Jewish discussion, about nationalism and the modes of it and so on, which is happening closer to his time and his place than Herder. But more interesting still, especially now in response or in thinking about Greg's question, I'm thinking about the Habsburg, the whole imperial discussion. So there's a whole revival of interest in imperial thought. Dan Diener and people like that have been working on that. And so a lot of this does have Habsburg resonances about nationalities and the social democratic version, Adler and others, of how to handle the nationality issue. And in that context, it also has legal articulations of a kind that it doesn't have the nationalism issue that the German discussions have. So it seems to me that one of the places for the book after the dissertation is finished to look would be Vienna. It would be Vienna, Prague. It would be the discussions, and of course there is also the intra-Russian discussion that's parallel. The whole problem of nationality, and it doesn't have quite the same advanced intellectual vitality, I suppose, but I think that I'm curious, partly biographically, whether you see cross-references like that, but then conceptually as well. And of course, Arendt herself has, the Jewish military and so on and so on. Arendt during the war is not Arendt after the war on this nationality question. That's a different issue. But I think the one about the connection with the Habsburg discussion and the Turkish discussion, all the empires have this discussion up to here. And so I think that's where the minority protection stuff comes from. And I would think that you would want to keep that link alive somewhere in your thinking about it. Maybe you have it elsewhere and just doesn't apply it here. It wasn't relevant here.
I talk about it in the sense of who Lemkin was before 1940, when the Nazi state forces him out. But that's really, thank you for.
It seems like he sort of starts with the Armenian question, right? And that seems like, very much a question of empire and group within the empire.
Right. One of the things that's interesting about the Armenia thing, he wrote this as a college paper. Lemkin was fluent in 13 languages by the age of 25, had a PhD already, and by 26 he had written the two most important.
Stop it.
This is like I read this guy's life like, what am I doing wrong?
Let's say he didn't have standing.
At the age of 26, he had translated the Italian legal code and the Russian legal code into Polish, and written the first criminal analysis of this. But one of the things which had fascinated, I just lost the last thing you said.
Armenian in
so
the Ottoman.
Lemkin's college paper is what gets him a job in the League of Nations Lawyers, where he writes that he looks at the courts around this, where individuals are assassinating the leaders of states, but then cases are coming up in domestic courts when assassination occurs. Obviously, the Armenian one fits, and all these juries are exonerating them on charges of insanity. So Lemkin, in this paper, he says, how can it be that you have to render somebody insane for taking revenge, and the state would do, right? Mm-hmm. The state would take that kind of revenge, but when an individual takes it, so that's. Yeah.
So just to follow up on David's question about sources, is Burke in the story here? Burke writes thousands of pages about India and Israel and English imperialism in India, basically arguing that Indians have their own culture and liberalism and English hubris, and saying that the Indians need the English to rule them is a destruction of Indian culture. And it's sort of a different romanticism as Herder. I'm wondering if that's, is Herder his source and not someone like Burke, or? But it fits with the Burke is a huge anti-imperialist. Right. The conservatives in this area are the anti-imperialists, whereas the liberals are the imperialists.
Right. Lemkin, I guess maybe I just haven't noticed this. I was telling David as I walked in, part of what makes my job so maddening is that Lemkin never cites anybody. It was 20,000 pages, right? He doesn't intend any of this.
I wish I could do that.
He doesn't intend for these to be read by the public. He's just writing. And he's such a Herderian that sometimes I get whole passages where he's writing without any punctuation or grammar. Come on, buddy, pull it together, reading your own text. So I don't know if he had a Burke in mind.
But do you know he has Herder in mind?
But he definitely has Herder in mind because, number one, he's mentioned Herder's name twice. And then from that clue, I've gone back and been able to look at whole passages of Herder and say, yeah, there it is. I haven't done that with books, but that's a great...
There's a great book on that, Uday Mehta's book, Liberalism and Empire. I don't know if you know it.
Yeah, I just got that from the library.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, and it tells that story of the connection in liberalism and empire, and Burke is the conservative opponent to it. Are there other? So, well then let me ask a question. A question that and I want to. And part of it is, how sure are you that Arendt has Lemkin in mind in this quote about that you mentioned about animals, right? I mean, the idea that human rights is human rights activists for her are the are like people who are for the Association for the Society of Protection Against Cruelty in Animals is one of her core lines in the origins. And what it really, as far as I understand it, has meant is that human rights folks basically say help, 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 and there's no grounding for it. There's no sense of why one should help, and it's basically saying instead of people taking care of themselves and resisting and acting on their own, they make a claim to some paternalistic world order, and they act like animals in the sense that, or they act like not animals, they act like people who say, oh, you should help the animals. The animals themselves might fight back. They're better than the human rights activists. And I'm just, and that applies generally to hundreds, if not thousands, of human rights activists right around the world at that point, making claims that we should have, with the minority treaties and with human rights, that we should have protected these people. So I'm wondering, what is it specifically about Lemkin's version that makes you think that she's appealing to or describing Lemkin in that instance?
The first part that clued me in is she writes before that about the jurist and scholar, and she's talking about in Origins totalitarianism. She's talking about Human Rights Convention and the Genocide Convention, humanitarian law in the UN. I think part of what I'm here today to do after the talk is go through Arendt's collection and see exactly what she would have known of Lemkin. Lemkin himself was a huge public figure in the world of UN circles and jurists and so forth, philosophers of international law. So I'm sure that she would have heard his name if she's paying attention to these issues. I mean, Lemkin's, in the space of 3 years, he's got tons of op-eds all around the world, and he's just got radio shows from Burma to Guatemala. He's known. So I think...
Like Bard College?
Yeah. And so Lemkin would have been known by somebody like Arendt. What I don't know is how systematically she knew Lemkin, right? I don't know if she'd actually read Lemkin's one published work in English, which is Axis, Rule, and Occupied Europe. And that's part of what I want to see, is just look at what books she would have had on genocide, what notes she had, and to see if I can prove that she did know. If I can prove that she did know Lemkin, then I can put this confidently in my dissertation.
Although there is still a question of whether that quote about society against cruelty to animals is referring to Lemkin or is about human rights activists.
Human rights activists, right.
And is there something particular about Lemkin's version?
Got it.
And that's the question, and I don't know.
Got it.
Yeah, I have another sort of genealogical question having to do with legal theory. Again, the anti-state stuff Gierke and so on, the question of whether and how his legal theory, what is connected to these various modes of pluralist legality, which, in this case, the references would be German, and that would be the most influential lines, and the German law versus Roman law stuff, which so it would be worth probing more deeply, not simply into the philosophical grounding of this nation concept or this nationality, but also the question of a legality that can comprehend and bear on those kinds of entities. And there I think you'd have to look, or at least check out, whether there is a connection to that Germanist law current that is, that would be relevant here. I mean, which is the most powerful force. It goes. I know it from labor law because it feeds in through Sinsheimer into German labor law and stuff. Right. But I'm sure that if you look at the question of international law or legality as administered vis-a-vis collectivities, that would be the place to go. That's not something you have found. I mean, you've not looked at the legal. Is all the legal theory in Polish? How's your Polish? Rozumie Popolski.
A lot of Lemkin's early writing is all in Polish,
okay.
And that has been introduction to Polish classes at Rutgers University.
But untranslated.
But it's well over 90% of his archives are all in English.
Okay.
And he's writing about American law, and for some reason he loves Spanish colonial law. I don't quite understand.
That had to do with slavery, incidentally.
Yeah.
That had to do with the enslavement of the Indians.
Yeah.
That was really interesting stuff.
Yeah. But and Lemkin believes slavery. He writes a lot about slavery. Well, that's thank you for that.
Yes, we have one last question, and then okay, go ahead.
Okay. A lot of the questions thus far have been about sort of Lemkin's intellectual genealogy and connections and predecessors. I have one question about sort of his echoes or lack thereof, sort of in the contemporary moment, and you talk about how Lemkin was kind of rediscovered in the early 1990s in the wake of these war crimes tribunals. What I'm struck by is the fact that so much of what Lemkin has to say, judging from the talk that you give, is really relevant to kind of contemporary or sort of 1990s discourses of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And I found myself wondering, like, well, I mean, I'm not an expert in theories of, political theory of multiculturalism, but like, there's people who are thinking along communitarian lines, who are theorizing, like Will Kimlicka, for instance, who are really kind of thinking about multiculturalism seriously. But to my knowledge, I don't think Lemkin is on their radar. And I'm wondering, is that just my misguided impression, or is that the case?
I'd say it's absolutely the case. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the story is that the Genocide Convention gets turned into a document that's about killing individuals. Mm-hmm. So when you read the text of it, it's very much about doing things to individuals because they belong as a group, maybe because we want to destroy the group. And I think people had never read Lemkin, and up until these tribunals actually said we want to return to Lemkin. Nobody thought that Lemkin was different than what the UN text had. That could be one answer, that they just didn't know that Lemkin would have actually been talking about the same thing. Mm-hmm. Historical curiosity, what I love, is that the Indian communitarian thinkers in 1946, they knew Lemkin, right? And this is what I was trying to work through this paper in Tokyo, right? It was just, they knew Lemkin, they liked it. And the romanticism resonated because of the deep romantic connections in Indian political thought.
It just, this is a part of the story that just really interests me, is how Lemkin, you know, in recent decades, how his ideas circulate and don't circulate.
Yeah.
That's something that
Yeah,
is really striking to me.
Lemkin's ideas first circulated with a Holocaust denier who said that Lemkin was, quote-unquote, inventing the Nazi genocide. He wasn't actually there to see it, he had fled. And how could he be writing about the genocide? So Lemkin has his whole career among Nazi denial circles, which just pop up on Google, unbelievable, circulated around these forums. And the second wave was Samantha Powers' book. She really did a lot to reclaim Lemkin,
Mhm.
No Problem from Hell.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think the Holocaust trumps genocide and shapes it, reshapes it,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that these connections would
Yeah.
become obsolete.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Just to have you comment on one thing at the end. You mentioned Algeria, and I'm wondering, today people are talking about Syria. Here you have not a genocide in any meaningful, in any sense of law, and yet you have a resistance movement, and yet you have some people calling for international right to protect. I mean, Michael Ignatieff wrote a piece today calling for right to protect to go into Syria. Just help me understand how Lemkin would analyze a case like Syria.
Lemkin has a lot to say about what he considers to be current genocides during his life.
I mean, would there be something like a genocide in Syria? I mean, is that
For him, the genocide would have to be the intention to destroy some national group, however you're going to define that. If it's just mass killing, that human rights can deal with that. Right? The Human Rights Declaration is about mass killing. So he probably wouldn't see the Syria massacres as genocide. But what I want to try and make this case in this dissertation, so I'm really eager to really look at Arendt, is that we get this idea, it comes out of the liberal tradition, that it's very much is that totalitarianism, genocide is about killing. And the belief that once the killing stops, politics disappears. And so you see these manifestations later where people say you can't negotiate with Bashir, you can't negotiate with Ahmadinejad, you can't negotiate with Assad. Lemkin never had those beliefs because he never believed that politics ended in genocide. Indeed, genocide was about politics. Right? So Lemkin goes in a very different direction. So he would not advocate for military intervention in Syria because he writes all the time. He still upholds that you can negotiate with Stalin. He maintains this. I don't know if I answered the question.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you for allowing me to test these ideas on Arendt.